Spring came late to Eagle Creek in 1883. The cottonwoods along the water were just beginning to leaf out when the woman walked down from the adobe house to fill her bucket at the spring. Her husband and the other men had ridden out before dawn to check on the sheep. There had been another Apache raid the week before. She left her friend inside with the children, picked up the wooden bucket, and started down the familiar path she had walked 100 times before. The sun was climbing toward midday. The air smelled of creosote and dust and the faint green scent of new growth along the creek. She never made it back. Her friend heard the screaming first, then came a sound like thunder, hoofbeats pounding the earth, moving fast. When she ran to the window, she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Something red and enormous, she would later tell the coroner. Something impossibly tall, moving through the brush with a lurching, unnatural gait, and on its back she saw what looked like a man, or the shape of a man, riding the beast. Then it was gone, crashing away through the willows. When the men returned that evening, they found the body near the spring. The coroner from Solomonsville rode out 3 days later. He examined the remains and filed his report. Death in some manner unknown. That was all he could say. They found the tracks. Afterward. Cloven hoof prints, each one twice the size of a horse's track, pressed deep into the soft earth near the water. Long red hairs caught in the willow branches. The men who saw them knew they had never seen anything like it before. Some thought Apache. Others thought something worse. Within a week, word had spread to the mining camps and ranches scattered across southeastern Arizona territory. Something was out there in the desert, something that killed. The miners at Chase Creek saw it a few days later. The thing came through their camp at night, collapsing tents, screaming like nothing they had ever heard. They found the same massive tracks in the morning, the same red hairs. 1 month after the woman died at Eagle Creek, a rancher named Cyrus Hamblin spotted it from a ridge while searching for stray cattle. Hamblin was a former cavalry soldier. He knew horses and mules. He knew camels, too, from his army service. What he saw that day, moving through the chaparral about a quarter-mile distant, was definitely a camel. But there was something on its back. Something that looked like a man, though Hamblin was quite certain the man was not alive. This is the story of the Red Ghost of Arizona Territory. It is a story that sits uneasily between documented history and frontier legend, between verifiable fact and campfire tale. At its center is a real military experiment that seemed absurd from the beginning and ended in chaos. At its edges are embellishments and inventions, the inevitable growth of folklore in isolated places where unusual events become amplified with each retelling. But at its core, supported by physical evidence and contemporary newspaper accounts, is something stranger than most legends. A feral camel, probably from the United States Army Camel Corps. Wandering the Arizona desert for a decade with the remains of a human being strapped to its back. The rawhide bindings had been on so long that they had cut through the camel's hide and into its flesh. By the time someone finally killed the animal in 1893, the corpse was long gone. Only the embedded leather strips and the scars remained. The question is not whether people saw something in the Arizona desert in the 1880s. Multiple witnesses with credible backgrounds reported encounters. Physical evidence was found and examined. A contemporary newspaper documented the animal's death and described its scars in detail. The question is what actually happened, how much can be verified, and how much grew in the telling. To answer that requires going back 3 decades before the Red Ghost appeared, to a moment when the United States Army decided to try something that had never been attempted before. They would import camels from the deserts of North Africa and the Middle East and deploy them in the American Southwest. The experiment would prove technically successful, but politically doomed. And when it ended, dozens of the animals would be released into the wild, setting the stage for one of the strangest legends in American frontier history. The story begins with a practical problem. In the 1850s, the United States had just acquired vast new territories in the Southwest following the Mexican-American War. The Army needed to establish supply lines and patrol routes across landscapes that bore no resemblance to anything American soldiers had encountered before. Deserts stretched for hundreds of miles without reliable water sources. Summer temperatures exceeded 120 degrees. The terrain ranged from sand dunes to rocky mountains to thorn bush-choked valleys. Horses and mules struggled. They required large quantities of water and forage that simply did not exist in many areas. They moved slowly through sand. They suffered in extreme heat. Supply trains needed multiple animals to carry loads that would barely sustain a patrol for a few days. Officers who had served in the region kept filing reports. The Southwest, they wrote, required a different approach. One officer in particular kept pushing the idea. Major George H. Crossman had served in Mexico and seen the terrain firsthand. He wrote to the War Department suggesting that the Army consider using camels. The animals had served military forces in desert regions for thousands of years. They could carry enormous loads. They could survive for days without water. They could eat vegetation that would starve a horse. Crossman was not the first to make the suggestion, but he made it persistently and with detailed arguments. Other officers who had traveled in the Middle East added their support. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi found the idea intriguing. When Davis became Secretary of War in 1853 under President Franklin Pierce, he had the authority to act on it. On March 3, 1855, Congress appropriated $30,000 for the purchase and importation of camels for military purposes. The amount was specific and the authorization was clear. Davis moved quickly. He ordered Brevet Major Henry C. Wayne to travel to the Mediterranean and North Africa to purchase camels suitable for American desert conditions. The USS Supply, a naval supply ship commanded by Lieutenant David Dixon Porter, would transport the animals. Wayne spent months traveling from port to port, visiting Tunisia, Malta, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt. He consulted with traders and camel breeders. He examined hundreds of animals. He wanted to acquire several different types to test which would perform best in American conditions. He negotiated prices and arranged for Arab and Turkish handlers to accompany the shipment. The work was meticulous and slow. The USS Supply departed New York on June 4, 1855. It returned on May 14, 1856, docking at Indianola, Texas, with 34 camels alive in its hold. A 35th was born during the voyage. The sight of camels being offloaded at a Texas port drew crowds. Newspapers sent reporters. Skeptics came to mock. Military officers came to assess. The animals themselves seemed unbothered by the attention. They stood 7 feet tall at the shoulder, with long necks that added another 3 feet of height. Their backs bore single or double humps, depending on their breed. Their feet were broad and soft, with 2 toes and a leathery pad that could expand on soft ground. Their eyes were protected by double rows of lashes and a 3rd eyelid. Their lips were flexible and prehensile, capable of grasping thorny vegetation that would tear the mouth of a horse. They looked, to American eyes, completely alien. Major Wayne was not finished. He returned to the Middle East on a second expedition and came back on February 10, 1857, with 41 additional camels. The total acquisition was now 75 animals, counting births. The herd included Arabian dromedaries with single humps, Bactrian camels from Central Asia with double humps, and various hybrids. 5 experienced handlers came with them, including a man named Haji Ali, who would later become known as Hi Jolly in American service. The Army now had the animals. The question was whether they could actually work. The military established Camp Verde in Texas specifically to house and test the Camel Corps. The facility opened on July 8, 1856, on the north bank of Verde Creek, 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. The design included a khan, a specialized camel corral with walls 10 feet high and 150 feet long, modeled after North African camel stations. Captain Innes Palmer commanded the installation. His orders were to test the animals thoroughly under realistic military conditions. Could they carry heavier loads than mules? Could they survive without water longer? Could they move faster across difficult terrain? Could soldiers learn to manage them? The tests began immediately. The results exceeded expectations. In September 1856, the Army sent 6 camels and 3 6-mule wagons on identical runs from San Antonio to Camp Verde, each hauling oats. The camels carried 3,200 pounds each, equivalent to 2 wagon loads. They completed the journey in 2 days. The mules took 5 days. The camels arrived in good condition. 2 of the mules died. Individual camels routinely carried loads between 550 and 800 pounds. The strongest Bactrians managed loads up to 1,236 pounds. The weight that would require a full wagon with multiple mules could be carried by a single camel. More importantly, the camels could do this across terrain where wagons could not operate at all. The Army's most ambitious test came with the wagon road expeditions led by Edward Fitzgerald Beale. Beale was a former Navy lieutenant who had become a surveyor and frontier explorer. His assignment was to map a wagon road along the 35th parallel from Fort Defiance in New Mexico Territory to the Colorado River in California. The War Department gave him 25 camels for the expedition. Beale departed Camp Verde on June 25, 1857 with 44 soldiers, 12 wagons, and the camel train. The route would cover 1,200 miles through some of the harshest terrain in North America. Rivers had to be forded, mountains had to be crossed, long, waterless stretches had to be traversed. The expedition faced all of it. They reached Fort Tejon, California on October 18, 1857. Every single camel survived. More than survived. They thrived. Beale's reports were enthusiastic. The camels had outperformed the mules at every stage. They moved faster. They required less water. They ate plants the mules would not touch. They carried heavier loads with less complaint. When the expedition crossed an 80-mile stretch without water, the mules suffered terribly, while the camels showed no distress. Beale recommended that the Army immediately purchase 1,000 more camels. Secretary of War John Floyd read the reports and agreed. In his 1858 annual report, Floyd wrote that the adaptation of camels to military operations on the plains could now be taken as demonstrated. He requested congressional approval to expand the program. Congress said no. They said no in 1858. They said no in 1859. They said no in 1860. The reasons varied. Some congressmen thought camels were a ridiculous waste of money. Some worried that Western horse and mule traders would lose business. Some simply did not want to approve anything associated with Jefferson Davis, who had by now become a polarizing political figure as tensions built toward civil war. Other military expeditions continued to use camels with success. Lieutenant Edward Beale led a second expedition. The Eccles-Hart's Big Bend expedition in May 1859 took 24 camels and 24 mules across an 85-mile waterless section of Texas. The camels completed the crossing without difficulty. 3 mules died. Even Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee used 20 camels on a long-range patrol in 1860 and praised their performance. But Congress would not expand the program. By 1860, the Camel Corps had proven itself technically but failed politically. Then came the Civil War. On February 28, 1861, Confederate forces captured Camp Verde. They issued a receipt: 12 mules, 80 camels, 2 Egyptian camel drivers. The Confederate Army used some of the camels to haul cotton to Brownsville for export. Others carried salt from desert playas to supply Confederate forces. One camel, named Old Douglas, became the mascot of Company A of the 43rd Mississippi Infantry. Old Douglas marched with the regiment through multiple campaigns until the siege of Vicksburg in 1863, where he was shot and killed. They buried him in Cedar Hill Cemetery. The epitaph, written by soldiers who had marched beside him, called him faithful in service. The California herd remained under Union control at Fort Tejon, but had no mission. The army was fully occupied with the war in the east. Nobody in Washington was thinking about camels. The animals sat idle, handlers left for other duties. The camels required care and feeding, but produced no military value. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reviewed the situation and apparently did not understand what the camels had accomplished before the war. He wrote that he could not ascertain that the animals had ever been employed in any way advantageous to the military service. He ordered them sold. The first auction took place on February 26, 1864, at Benicia Arsenal near San Francisco. Samuel McLaughlin, a former Army camel teamster who understood the animals, purchased 37 camels for a total of $1,945. That worked out to roughly $52 per animal. McLaughlin had plans. He shipped the camels to Nevada to haul salt and supplies to the silver mines in Virginia City. He organized camel races in Sacramento that drew crowds of more than 1,000 spectators. Eventually, he sold some to circuses and others to zoos, but he also let some go. Camels escaped. Camels were abandoned when they proved difficult to manage. Camels walked away from camps and disappeared into the desert. The Texas auction followed on March 6, 1866, at Camp Verde. Bethel Coopwood, a San Antonio lawyer and former Confederate officer, purchased 66 camels for a total of $1,364. That came to approximately $20 per animal. Coopwood operated freight and mail service between Laredo and Mexico City for about 3 years. He sold 5 camels to Ringling Brothers Circus. He sold others to Mexican circus owners. And like McLaughlin, he found that camels were harder to manage than horses or mules. Some owners simply turned them loose. The desert had feral camels now. The last official military use of camels occurred in 1866. The Army and Navy Journal published what amounted to an obituary on January 13th. The headline read, simply, "Camels." The article noted that the camels were going at auction, and that 66 of them were now at Camp Verde, awaiting sale. Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs, who had supported the program, expressed regret that the experiment had ended. But it had ended. The United States Army Camel Corps was dissolved. The animals were scattered, and in the years that followed, people across the Southwest began reporting strange sightings. The sightings were credible. In 1875, soldiers at Camp Verde reported seeing one of the old camels near the abandoned facility. In 1885, a 5-year-old boy at Fort Selden in New Mexico saw what he described as a curious and frightening animal with a blobbish head, a long and curving neck, and shambling legs. The boy was Douglas MacArthur, son of an Army captain who would later command Allied forces in the Pacific during World War II. His memory of the camel remained vivid decades later. In 1887, surveyors working for the International Boundary Commission spotted a pair of healthy camels 60 kilometers from the Mexico-United States border. In 1907, a prospector in Nevada reported seeing a pair in the wilderness far from any settlement. These were not folklore. These were documented sightings by military personnel, government surveyors, and named witnesses. Camels are extraordinarily adapted to desert survival. They can survive 5 to 7 days without water, losing up to 40% of their body weight without impairment. When humans lose 10% of body weight to dehydration, they fail. When camels do drink, they can consume 35 gallons in 10 minutes. Their urine is highly concentrated, and their feces are extremely dry, minimizing water loss. They can raise their body temperature by 6 degrees Celsius before they begin sweating, a unique adaptation that no other mammal possesses. Their thick fur insulates against both heat and cold. They can eat thorny scrub, dried leaves, bones, and sparse vegetation that would starve other animals. Their broad, flat feet with expandable pads prevent them from sinking in sand. Their eyes are protected by double-row eyelashes, bushy eyebrows, a third eyelid, and closable nostrils against sandstorms. They can lie on hot ground without burning because of leathery pads on their feet, knees, elbows, and sternum. In short, camels are engineered for desert survival. Individual feral camels could and did survive for decades in the American Southwest. The last confirmed feral army camel died in 1934. Her name was Topsy. She spent her final years at Griffith Park Zoo in Los Angeles and was estimated to be 70 to 80 years old at death. Her skeleton is preserved at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Modern camel experts estimate that 6 to 10 actual feral camels survived into the 1890s in remote areas of Arizona, Nevada, and California. They moved at night, they avoided settlements, they grazed on desert plants in areas where humans rarely traveled. Most were never seen. A few were spotted and reported. And one, according to the evidence, carried something on its back that terrified everyone who saw it. Arizona Territory in 1883 was among the most dangerous and isolated places in America. The 1880 census counted 40,440 people, excluding Native Americans on reservations. That number included every miner, rancher, soldier, merchant, and settler in 112,920 square miles. The population density was 1/2 person per square mile. Most people lived in a handful of towns. Tucson had 5,150 residents. Phoenix had 3,152. Tombstone, at the height of its silver boom, had 1,875. Prescott had 1,759. Globe had 1,261. Outside those towns were ranches separated by tens of miles, mining camps accessible only by burro trail, and vast stretches of empty desert. The Apache Wars were still ongoing. Chief Victorio had been killed in 1880, but the conflicts continued. In 1881, the Cibecue Creek incident sparked an uprising. In 1882, raids by White Mountain Apache warriors required 14 companies of cavalry to pursue. Geronimo would not surrender until September 1886, 3 years after the first Red Ghost incident. Until then, isolated settlers lived under constant threat. They worried about Apache raids by day and rustlers by night. Sleep deprivation was endemic. Constant vigilance was required. Genuine mortal danger was a daily reality. When the woman at Eagle Creek was killed in 1883, she had been left alone because the men had gone to check on sheep after an Apache raid. The raids were recent. The danger was real. The mining boom added to the chaos. Tombstone's silver mines had been discovered in 1877. By 1881, 6,000 miners worked underground. The richest ore assayed at $22,000 per ton. Over its productive life, Tombstone would produce an estimated 32 million ounces of silver worth over $1 billion in modern value. The copper boom began in 1883 when the United Verde Copper Company incorporated. Mining camps like Ore, near where the Red Ghost was eventually killed, were remote collections of tents and shacks where prospectors lived in isolation. Supplies came by burro-pack train or 20-mule freight wagon. Communication with the outside world was sporadic at best. The Southern Pacific Railroad reached Tucson on March 20, 1880, and El Paso in May 1810, with the Golden Spike driven in January 1883. The Atlantic and Pacific Railroad reached Flagstaff in 1882. Telegraph service connected major army posts and towns, but vast areas remained completely isolated. A ranch might be half a day's ride from the nearest neighbor. Mail came once a week if it came at all. News traveled by word of mouth. Rumors and legends grew with each retelling before they ever reached a newspaper. This was the environment where the Red Ghost appeared, isolated, violent, exhausted, and primed to see monsters in the desert. The first documented incident occurred in spring of 1883 at Eagle Creek in southeastern Arizona Territory. The location was approximately 50 miles northwest of Clifton, near the White Mountain Range. 2 women were alone at an adobe house with their children while the men checked the sheep. One woman went to the spring for water. The second woman heard screaming and looked out the window. She saw something enormous and red, moving fast, with what appeared to be something riding on its back. The body was found near the spring, trampled almost flat. A coroner came from Solomonsville and held an inquest. His verdict was death in some manner unknown. Searchers found cloven hoof prints twice the size of a horse's tracks. They found long red hairs caught in willow bushes near the water. A few days later, 2 prospectors were sleeping in their tent at a mining camp on Chase Creek, a tributary of the Rio San Francisco several miles northeast of Eagle Creek. Something crashed into their tent in the night, collapsing it on top of them. They heard a loud scream and pounding hoofbeats moving away. In the morning, miners from the camp of Ore came to investigate. They found prints of huge hoofs. They found a trail of broken brush where something large had passed. They found red hairs on the bushes. Whatever had killed the woman at Eagle Creek was still moving through the territory. About a month after the Eagle Creek death, a rancher named Cyrus Hamblin was hunting for stray cattle near the Salt River, approximately 80 miles northwest of Eagle Creek. Hamblin climbed a ridge to get a better view. About a quarter mile away, he saw a huge reddish animal moving through the chaparral. Hamblin had served in an army cavalry regiment. He had seen horses and mules all his life. He had also seen camels during his service. What he saw that day was definitely a camel. And there was something on its back, an oddly shaped burden that looked like a man, though Hamblin was certain the man was not alive. Hamblin's reputation as a sober, reliable witness gave weight to his account. People who knew him believed his story. A few weeks after Hamblin's sighting, 5 prospectors working in the valley of the Verde River spotted the animal feeding on a mesa. They approached within shooting distance and fired their rifles. They either missed or merely grazed it, because the animal took off at a run. But something fell from its back as it fled. The prospectors went to investigate. What they found was a human skull with a few shreds of flesh and hair still clinging to it. They reported the discovery. The skull was evidence that whatever was strapped to the camel's back had once been a living person. The story spread. The Red Ghost, as people were now calling it, became firmly established as more than rumor. A few days after the skull discovery, men camped with a freight wagon on the banks of the Verde River were awakened by what they described as an unearthly scream. What happened next is less clear. The men claimed the beast was 30 feet high and had black wings. They said it landed among them like an earthquake, knocking over wagons. The next morning they found prints of huge cloven hooves and red hairs on an overturned wagon. The claim about the 30-foot height and black wings is obviously impossible. Camels stand 7 to 8 feet tall at most. They do not have wings. The cargo included several kegs of whiskey. The physical evidence, the prints and the hairs, may have been real. The witness testimony was almost certainly enhanced by alcohol and terror. Nearly a year after the Eagle Creek death, in spring of 1884, a cowhand working at the Anchor Jout Ranch east of Phoenix rode past the branding corral just at dusk. He saw an odd animal browsing inside the corral. Operating on instinct, he lassoed it. The animal charged. The rope caught around its neck. Only then did the cowhand realize he had roped a camel. His horse reared in terror. The camel crashed head-on into the off-balance horse. Mount and rider went down. As the camel passed over them, the cowhand got a clear look at what was on the camel's back, a remnant of a burden which once had been a man. By this point, a year after the initial incident, the corpse had decomposed to partial remains. But it was still there, still attached. The sightings and encounters continued for years. Some of the reports are credible, others clearly are not. Stories circulated that the Red Ghost had killed and eaten a grizzly bear, which is zoologically impossible because camels are herbivores. Stories spread that the beast could vanish into thin air, that it broke into cabins, that it caved in mine entrances. These are the embellishments that inevitably attach to frontier legends. The core story, however, remained consistent. A large red camel, Something on its back that had once been human. Violence when the animal was startled or threatened. And then, after a decade of reported sightings across southeastern Arizona territory, the story reached its conclusion. The man who killed the red ghost was named Mizoo Hastings. He owned a ranch a little above the gold camp of Ora, on the San Francisco River in eastern Arizona. On a morning sometime in late 1892 or early 1893, Hastings woke up and looked out the window of his cabin. He saw a big red camel eating turnips in his garden. Hastings took careful aim from the windowsill and fired. He killed the animal with a single shot. When Hastings went out to examine what he had killed, he found that the camel was covered with scars. It had clearly had a very hard life. More significant was what he found on the animal's back and body. The camel was covered with a perfect network of knotted rawhide strips. The strips had been on the animal so long that some of them had cut their way into the flesh. The rawhide was wound and twisted all over the back, the shoulders, and even under the tail. The pattern was complex and tight. It could not have been tied by the person who had been the burden. Someone else had deliberately strapped a human being to this camel, using multiple lengths of rawhide bound in a way that would hold the body secure, even as it decomposed. The rawhide had embedded into the camel's hide and remained there as permanent scars even after the corpse had completely disintegrated and fallen away. This was not speculation. This was physical evidence examined by the man who killed the animal. The Mojave County Miner newspaper in Kingman, Arizona territory published an account on February 25, 1893. The article was titled, "The Phantom That Terrified All Arizona for a Time." It described the Eagle Creek death, the subsequent sightings, and Hastings's killing of the animal. The newspaper noted that the only question remaining was whether the man had been tied on for revenge, or merely as an ugly piece of humor by someone who had a camel and a corpse for which he had no use. The victim's identity was never established. No records have been found naming who was strapped to the camel or why. The rawhide binding pattern proved that another person had done this deliberately. But who the victim was, who killed him, and why his corpse was secured to a feral camel remained unknown. The physical evidence tells a timeline. In spring 1883 at Eagle Creek, the witness saw what looked like a devil riding the beast, suggesting a relatively intact corpse. By summer 1883 at Hamblin's sighting, the burden looked like a man who was clearly not alive, indicating decomposition. Also in summer 1883 at the Verde River, a skull with flesh and hair fell off, showing the skeleton beginning to disarticulate. By spring 1884 at the Anchor Joti Ranch, only a remnant of what had been a man remained. By 1893, when Hastings killed the animal, the corpse was completely gone. Only the rawhide strips and the scars they had cut into the camel's flesh remained. This progression over approximately 10 years is entirely consistent with natural decomposition combined with mechanical wear from the camel's movement, gradually breaking down and shedding the remains. The question is, what can be verified? The United States Army Camel Corps is extensively documented in congressional records, Navy expedition reports, Army records, and Secretary of War annual reports from 1854 through 1860. The purchase of 75 camels is confirmed. The expeditions led by Edward Beale are documented with detailed reports and maps. The Civil War capture of Camp Verde by Confederate forces is recorded. The 1864 California auction and the 1866 Texas auction both have documentation. Multiple credible witnesses reported feral camel sightings through the 1880s and into the early 1900s. The existence of feral army camels in the Southwest is established fact. The Red Ghost incidents are less thoroughly documented. The primary source is a single newspaper article in the Mojave County Miner from February 25, 1893. That article, written 10 years after the initial incidents, appears to document oral tradition that had circulated throughout Arizona territory during the 1880s. No contemporary newspaper accounts from 1883 of the Eagle Creek death have been located in digitized archives. This creates uncertainty about specific details. However, the 10-year gap between alleged events and first written documentation actually supports authenticity rather than undermining it. Pure folklore typically generates written accounts more quickly as it spreads. A story that circulates orally for a decade before being written down suggests it was well known locally but not considered newsworthy enough for immediate publication, which fits a pattern of frontier communities dealing with unusual but explicable events. The naming of Cyrus Hamblin as a witness is significant. Hamblin was a real person with relevant military experience who could definitively identify a camel. The naming of Mizoo Hastings as the man who killed the animal is significant. These are not generic unnamed witnesses. They are named individuals from specific locations. The physical evidence found by Hastings, rawhide strips embedded in scar tissue, is consistent with long-term attachment of a burden using traditional binding methods. The progressive decomposition timeline from intact corpse to skeleton to fragments to nothing but bindings over 10 years is consistent with natural processes. The behavioral pattern of an animal in constant pain from embedded leather strips becoming violently aggressive is consistent with documented camel behavior. What can be said with confidence is this. Feral camels from the disbanded Army Camel Corps did roam the Southwest for decades. Multiple credible witnesses reported sightings. In the 1880s, something in southeastern Arizona territory killed a woman, terrorized mining camps, and was repeatedly seen by witnesses over several years. In 1893, a rancher named Mizoo Hastings shot and killed a camel that had rawhide strips embedded in its flesh from years of wear. The Mojave County miner documented these events in a contemporary newspaper account. The core elements of the story are supported by physical evidence and named witnesses. What cannot be verified are many specific details of individual encounters. The grizzly bear story is an obvious invention. The 30-foot height and black wings are physically impossible. The exact dates of most incidents are not recorded. Most witnesses are not named. Many dramatic details likely grew in the retelling as the stories spread through isolated mining camps and ranches before reaching a newspaper. This is the nature of frontier legends. They often have a factual core that becomes embellished over time. The scientific explanation for what happened is straightforward. A feral camel, probably released when its owner found it too difficult to manage after the 1866 auction, wandered into southeastern Arizona territory. At some point, someone either as a cruel joke, as revenge, or to dispose of a body strapped a human corpse to the camel using rawhide bindings. The binding pattern was complex and thorough, designed to hold the burden secure. The rawhide eventually embedded into the camel's flesh, causing constant pain. The pain made the normally docile animal aggressive and unpredictable. When humans encountered it, especially at night or in poor light, the 7-foot-tall animal with a lurching gait and a corpse on its back appeared monstrous. Horses fled from the camel's smell, adding to the terror. The camel moved through remote areas for approximately 10 years while the corpse gradually decomposed and fell away. Eventually, it was shot by a rancher and examined, revealing the embedded rawhide that proved the story's core truth. Why someone would strap a corpse to a camel remains unknown. The victim's identity remains unknown. Whether this was murder, followed by disposal, revenge killing, or simply a grotesque joke remains unknown. These gaps in the historical record will probably never be filled. But the central fact that it happened is supported by physical evidence and contemporary documentation. The Red Ghost became one of Arizona's most enduring legends. It was retold around campfires and in saloons. It appeared in newspapers across the country. It became the subject of books and articles. Modern historians have assessed it as important Arizona folklore with a probable historical basis. The town of Quartzsite, Arizona, erected a monument to High Jolly, one of the original Army camel handlers. Near the monument stands a sculpture of a red camel made from scrap car parts, a tribute to the legend. The story represents a moment when America's western expansion collided with a failed military experiment, producing something that seemed to belong more to nightmare than to history. The broader significance lies in what the story reveals about frontier life. Arizona Territory in the 1880s was a place where strange things could happen and be believed because life itself was strange. Apache raids were real. Mine cave-ins killed dozens at a time. Summer heat reached fatal levels. Water sources were separated by 80-mile stretches of empty desert. The nearest doctor might be 100 miles away. Communication with the outside world was sporadic. In this environment, a 7-foot-tall animal that stampeded horses and carried a corpse on its back was unusual, but not impossible. It fit within the range of things that could happen in a place where the normal rules did not seem to apply. The story also reveals how legends form and spread. The Red Ghost incidents occurred in 1883 and 1884, but the first newspaper account did not appear until 1893. For 10 years, the story circulated orally. It was told by miners who had seen the tracks. It was told by ranchers who had heard the screaming. It was told by cowboys who knew Cyrus Hamblin and believed his account. With each retelling, details were added. The beast grew larger. Its actions became more dramatic. Impossible elements like the grizzly bear encounter were invented. By the time a newspaper finally documented the story, it had grown far beyond the original events. Separating fact from embellishment became difficult, but the core remained. The U.S. Army Camel Corps itself stands as one of history's interesting might-have-beens. The experiment was technically successful. Every practical test showed that camels outperformed horses and mules in desert conditions. They carried heavier loads over longer distances with less water and less food. They survived in terrain where other animals died. Edward Beale's expeditions proved the concept beyond doubt. If the Civil War had not intervened, if Congress had approved expansion funding, if political support had continued, the American West might have been opened by camel trains instead of wagon trains. The route that Beale surveyed with camels in 1857 eventually became U.S. Route 66. Camels blazed that trail first. Instead, the program was cancelled, and the animals were sold at auction for prices that barely covered the cost of their feed. Dozens were released into the wild, where they survived for decades as feral populations. The last documented feral army camel died in 1934, 78 years after the first shipment arrived at Indianola. That longevity speaks to how well adapted the animals were to American deserts. It also speaks to how thoroughly the experiment was forgotten. By the 1930s, most Americans had no idea that the U.S. Army had ever used camels. The animals had become legend and curiosity. Topsy's skeleton in Los Angeles was labeled as a circus oddity. Her origin as part of a military experiment was barely remembered. The Red Ghost holds a particular place in this history because it represents the dark epilogue to the camel experiment. The program ended not with a triumphant vindication of its technical success, but with animals sold cheaply and scattered. Some went to circuses. Some went to freight operators who found them unprofitable. Some were simply turned loose. The feral population that resulted wandered the Southwest for decades, mostly unseen, occasionally reported, generally ignored. And one of them, through circumstances that can only be guessed at, became attached to a human corpse and terrified an entire territory for 10 years. On that morning when Mizoo Hastings looked out his cabin window and saw a red camel eating his turnips, he ended a story that had begun 40 years earlier, with congressional appropriations and Navy expeditions to the Mediterranean. The rawhide strips embedded in the dead camel's flesh were the last physical evidence of the U.S. Army Camel Corps' strange afterlife in the American West. What happened to those strips, whether they were preserved or discarded, is not recorded. No museum has them. No photograph shows them. They exist now only in the newspaper description and in the legend that grew from them. The woman who died at Eagle Creek in 1883 has no name in any surviving record. The man whose corpse was strapped to the camel has no name. These gaps remind us that frontier history is full of people who vanished without leaving traces. The woman went to draw water on an ordinary morning and never returned. Someone, somewhere, tied a dead man to a camel and sent both into the desert. These were real events that happened to real people. But their names and stories are lost. What remains is the legend of the Red Ghost, which is both more and less than the truth. The last confirmed sighting of a feral camel in Arizona occurred in the 1940s. After that, they were gone. The desert had reclaimed them, or they had simply died of age. Their descendants, if any survived long enough to breed, would have been absorbed into isolation or death. The landscape that had briefly hosted these strange immigrants returned to its familiar inhabitants. By the 1950s, most people who remembered seeing the camels were dead. The experiment had ended. The animals were gone, only the stories remained. And the stories persist. The Red Ghost appears in books about Arizona history and frontier legends. It appears in articles about strange creatures and unsolved mysteries. It appears in collections of Western folklore alongside tales of lost mines and ghost towns. Tourists visiting Arizona sometimes ask about it. The monument to High Jolly in Quartzsite draws visitors who want to connect with this odd chapter of Western history. The story has become part of the cultural landscape of Arizona as surely as the saguaro cactus and the Grand Canyon. It represents something that seems impossible but happened, something that blurs the line between history and legend. Spring comes late to Eagle Creek. The cottonwoods leaf out slowly. Water runs clear and cold from the mountains. The desert smells of creosote and dust and the faint green scent of new growth. On a morning a century and 40 years after the Red Ghost first appeared, the place looks much as it did then. Remote, beautiful, harsh. The kind of place where unusual things could happen and be believed because every day was unusual. The adobe house where two women waited while men checked the sheep is long gone. The spring still flows, the willows still grow along the water. And somewhere in the administrative records of Solomonsville, filed and forgotten, is a coroner's report from 1883 that says only this: death in some manner unknown. The foundation: America's Camel Experiment, Congressional Authorization and Acquisition. On March 3, 1855, Congress appropriated $30,000 for a military transportation experiment that seemed absurd to many observers. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis personally ordered Brevet Major Henry C. Wayne to acquire camels for the U.S. Army. The USS Supply, commanded by Lieutenant David Dixon Porter, departed New York on June 4, 1855, visiting Tunisia, Malta, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt to purchase animals suitable for American deserts. The first shipment arrived at Indianola, Texas on May 14, 1856, with 34 camels, 33 purchased plus one calf born during the voyage. The second expedition returned on February 10, 1857, with 41 additional camels. Total acquisition, 70 camels. Some sources cite 75, likely including subsequent births. The shipments included 9 dromedaries, 1 humped Arabian, 23 Bactrian, 2 humped, and hybrids. 5 Arab and Turkish handlers accompanied the animals, including the legendary Haji Ali, known as High Jolly. Camp Verde establishment and operations. The Army established its camel base at Camp Verde, Texas on July 8, 1856, on the north bank of Verde Creek, 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. The facility featured a khan, camel corral, modeled after North African designs with 150-foot-long walls standing 10 feet high. Captain Innes N. Palmer commanded the camp. Testing proved spectacular. In September 1856, 6 camels outperformed 3 6-mule wagons in hauling oats from San Antonio, carrying the equivalent of 2 wagon loads, 3,648 pounds, and completing the trip in 2 days versus 5 for the mules, a 42.5-hour advantage. Individual camels carried 550–800 pounds routinely, with Bactrians capable of 3/4 of a ton. The Beale expeditions prove the concept. Edward Fitzgerald Beale, former Navy lieutenant and surveyor, led the most successful camel operations. His first wagon road survey departed Camp Verde on June 25, 1857, with 25 camels, 44 soldiers, and 12 wagons, traveling 1,200 miles from Fort Defiance, New Mexico Territory, to the Colorado River along the 35th parallel. The expedition reached Fort Tejon, California, on October 18, 1857. All camels survived the journey, creating a route that would later become the basis for Route 66. The most dramatic test came during the Eccles-Hart's Big Bend expedition in May 1859. When 24 camels and 24 mules crossed an 85-mile waterless stretch, the camels showed no distress, while the mules suffered severely. 3 mules died. All camels survived. Even Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, who used 20 camels on a long-range patrol in 1860, praised their endurance, docility, and sagacity, stating the reconnaissance would have failed without them. Secretary of War John Floyd declared in 1858, "The entire adaptation of camels to military operations on the plains may now be taken as demonstrated." He requested congressional approval for 1,000 additional camels. Congress denied the request 3 times. Civil War death sentence. The Civil War killed the camel. Cause. On February 28, 1861, Confederate forces captured Camp Verde, issuing a receipt for 12 mules, 80 camels, 2 Egyptian camel drivers. Some camels hauled Confederate cotton to Brownsville and salt for the war effort. Old Douglas, a camel mascot of the 43rd Mississippi Infantry Company A, was shot during the Vicksburg siege and buried in Cedar Hill Cemetery. The California herd remained under Union control at Fort Tejon, but languished without purpose. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, apparently unaware of the successful expeditions, ordered the animals sold, stating, "I cannot ascertain that these have ever been so employed as to be of any advantage to the military service." Auction dispersal and the beginning of feral populations. The California auction occurred on February 26, 1864, at Benicia Arsenal, near San Francisco. Samuel McLaughlin, a former Army camel teamster, purchased 37 camels for $145 total, approximately $52.56 per animal. He shipped them to Nevada for salt and mining supply, transport in Virginia City, organized camel races in Sacramento, attracting 1,000 spectators, and eventually sold some to circuses and zoos. The Texas auction followed on March 6, 1866, some sources say March 4th, at Camp Verde. Bethel Coopwood, a San Antonio lawyer and former Confederate officer, purchased 66 camels for $1,364 total, approximately $20.67 per animal. Sources conflict on whether 44 or 66 camels were sold. 66 is more frequently cited. Coopwood operated freight and mail service between Laredo and Mexico City for 3 years before selling 5 to Ringling Brothers Circus and Mexican circus owners. The Army and Navy Journal published an obituary for the program on January 13, 1866, titled simply "Camels." The camels are going. They are going at auction. 66 of the camels are now at Camp Verde. Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs approved the sale, expressing regret that the experiment had ended. Many owners, finding the animals difficult to manage and economically impractical as railroads expanded, simply released their camels into the desert. Edward Beale kept some on his Tejon ranch in California for years. Others went to butchers and meat markets, but dozens of feral camels now wandered the southwest deserts, establishing the conditions for the Red Ghost legend.